Well, thank you everyone for coming. Tonight we have Michael Ponsor here to talk about his book, The One-Eyed Judge, which is the sequel to his first book, The Hanging Judge. The Honorable Judge Michael Ponsor was a Springfield federal judge, or still is, I think.
Yes.
Semi-retired, right?
Yep.
After 3 decades on the bench. His first novel, The Hanging Judge, reached the New York Times bestseller list, and this is the sequel featuring the same main character, Judge David Norcross. So I hope you all enjoy this talk and his book.
Great, thank you. Is this a good place for me to stay for the,
Oh, yeah,
the
that's,
camera?
yes, that's perfect.
I prefer to stand next to the podium
Sure.
and hide behind it.
No.
It isn't a large group, so I'm not going to be terribly formal. I'm Michael Ponsor. I've been a federal judge for 34 years. Started out in 1984, working as what's called a magistrate judge, which is a subordinate federal judge. And in 1994, President Clinton appointed me a U.S. District Court judge. There's about 750 of us in the country, 13 in Massachusetts, 11 in Boston, 1 in Worcester, and then I've been the judge for the last 30 years out in Springfield. Until recently, my successor was appointed, and so now I'm sort of semi-retired and spend a little bit less time in court. I started writing when I was in my 20s, and in fact wrote an entire manuscript of a novel when I was in my 20s called When the Bow Breaks, which I got an agent in New York, and I was very optimistic that we were going to be able to sell it, but it never was picked up. Which might have been a good thing. I was kind of hoping, I was at Oxford then, and I was kind of hoping that I would sell the book and I wouldn't have to go to law school, but it turned out I had to go to law school. And then when I was at law school, I actually published what was my complete works up until publication of The Hanging Judge in 2013. I published a short story in Red Book, which was sold for $1,500 in 1973, which was like a fortune. And I thought, all I'd have to do is sell 10 of these a year, and I'd be able to avoid going to law school. But that was pretty much all I sold. And I went on to be an attorney, first in Boston doing criminal defense work, and then in Amherst with the general practice and a small law firm there. And then in 1984, I put on the robe, and I've been wearing the robe in court for 34 years. And really loving it, although I was kind of hoping to be hit as a writer and be able to avoid a legal career. It's actually turned out to be very rewarding and very interesting. I've enjoyed being a lawyer. I didn't enjoy law school much. I actually dropped out for a while and then came back and finished up. But I enjoyed being an attorney, and I've really enjoyed being a federal judge. I'm what I call a TGIM person. Thank God it's Monday. I love going to work every day. I love the cases that I have, and I've worked pretty hard over the years. All during that time, I continued to try to write fiction. I wrote an entire novel. I wrote big pieces, meaning 300 or 400 page pieces of at least 3 other novels that are right now gathering fuzz in the boxes in my closet. And then I had this experience which was really an incredible eye-opener for me, and what kind of inspired me to sit down and really try to write in a disciplined way. And that was that I, as a federal judge, I drew a death penalty case. Death penalty cases are pretty rare across courts everywhere, and they're particularly rare in federal court. Most judges never get a death penalty case, but I got one in the year 2000. And the defendant was a nurse at a Veterans Administration hospital in Leeds, which is just west of Northampton. And she was accused of murdering 4 of her patients by giving them massive doses of epinephrine, which is synthetic adrenaline, and triggering a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. She would do it during the night shift when no one else was around, and they would sort of be there. And there's a thing that they put in your arm. Those of you who've been in the hospital for any period of time probably know about this. It's called a hep lock. which is kind of like a plug that they put in your arm, and they can start an IV easily and give you fluids or medication that way. But it gets clogged, and the nurse has to rinse it with saline to keep it open so they can use it. And she would come in and say, I'm going to rinse your headlock with saline, and instead of giving them saline, she would give them a big boost of adrenaline, and that would trigger a fatal cardiac arrhythmia most of the time. In a couple of cases, the people didn't actually die, so she was eventually charged with 4 murders and 3 attempted murders, and the government sought the death penalty. The responsibility to preside over a death penalty case is incredibly heavy, and probably the heaviest personal and professional responsibility I've ever had in my life. You can imagine what it would be like. My courtroom is actually a little bit wider than this, a little bit deeper than this. It's got a higher ceiling, but it's, and I'm up there, and I'm looking out over the potential jurors who have come, and I'm saying to them, now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want you to know that this is a capital case, and if you are selected to be on the jury, it will be your responsibility to decide whether Kristen Gilbert should be deliberately killed. And even when I say that in this room right now, you can kind of feel the air thickening up a little bit as you imagine being in that position of having that kind of weighty responsibility. And the responsibility of presiding over a trial like that, which I had my task was to make sure that the government got its fair trial. They really felt that they had a killer on their hands who needed to be taken off the street and who deserved to be executed. And the defense, which passionately argued that she was innocent and the government could not prove her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It took us a month to pick a jury, interviewing the jurors one by one, day by day, and eventually we got 18 jurors, 12 jurors, and 6 alternates, and we began the trial, which then went on for another 4 months through the winter, starting in October. And it was incredible, and part of the reason that it took so long was because we were trying 4 separate murders and 3 separate attempted murders, so it was really 7 cases in one. And at the end of that period of time, the jury found her guilty on all the charges. I had a funny experience before the trial started. The trial started in October of 2000, and over the summer I had to go into the hospital for a minor medical procedure, and I was there overnight, and there I am, yeah, and I have a headlock in my arm, and I'm lying there in my bed, and it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's very dark. You know, they kind of prop you up a little bit, and I'm kind of lying there. And then I look over, and there's this nurse standing next to me, and she has a syringe in her hand, and she says, I need to rinse out your headlock with saline. So I'm kind of like, and I was tempted to say, can we do this in the morning when there are other people around? I'd feel a lot more comfortable with that. And but in the end, I just kind of said, go ahead, and so I'm here to tell the tale. But it really brought home to me how utterly defenseless we are in that type of medical setting, and how completely we trust the people who are providing us with care, and how entirely justified that is in 99.99% of the cases, but also what a huge betrayal it is when somebody turns around and starts doing this sort of depraved conduct, actually killing people. Well, after they found her guilty, the second portion of the trial followed, where the jury actually had to decide what to do with Ms. Gilbert, who was about 33, 34 years old, a fairly nice-looking youngish woman with 2 young boys, about 6 and 8 years old, who was somewhat popular at the hospital. She was everybody's favorite Secret Santa during Christmas and organized birthday parties and things like that. Very smart, and we listened to the evidence, and 12 people had to weigh her background, her conduct, the impact of her execution, what it would be, and whether it was justified to send her off to Indiana, which is where the Federal Bureau of Prisons has its facility to execute people who've been found guilty and where juries have found that they should be executed. And in the end, the jury decided not to do that. There were only 2 sentences when she was found guilty. One was execution by lethal injection, which is kind of ironic since that's what she'd been doing, giving people lethal injections. So she was about to get the ironic same treatment. But in our system, the jury must be unanimous for the death penalty. And so if they aren't unanimous, normally when a jury's not unanimous, we have what we call a hung jury, and we dismiss the jury in cases retried until you get unanimity. But with the decision with regard to capital punishment, the jury must be unanimous, and if they aren't unanimous, the automatic sentence is life imprisonment without hope of parole. And she's now in Texas in a maximum security federal prison, and she will be there until she dies. Our federal system, life imprisonment really means life imprisonment. You don't have somebody who gets life and then 11 years later you find him in a 7-Eleven buying a Slurpee. Yes, sir?
Why did she do this? What motivated her? It sounds like it would never even cross her mind.
Yes, well, there were a lot of theories about why that was, and the government had one theory which I partially accepted, and that was that she was a kind of what they call a code bug. If somebody in a hospital goes into crisis where their life is at risk from a heart attack or a stroke or some sudden decline in their health, something happens which is called a code. And it's like an emergency situation. There's a code cart, and there's various other things that happen, and it's very exciting. If you get excited by that kind of thing, I personally would find it terrifying. But the government's theory was that she enjoyed that, the way some people can be firebugs. You know, they light a fire, and then they stand back, and all the fire engines come, and people are running around, and they're trying to get people out. And the government's theory was partly that she was that, and the other thing was this was a case that had everything. She was married. Her husband actually testified during the trial. As I said, she had 2 children. But of course, she was also having an affair with a young security guard who looked kind of like Tom Cruise. And so she would try to precipitate these codes, because when there was a code, for reasons I don't quite understand, the security guard would come and kind of stand in the door to the room to kind of keep people who didn't belong there from getting in. And she could kind of show off to him during this code thing. And so the government's position was that she got to like this and like all the excitement and like being the center of attention. And that's how she got into doing it. My own take on it was a little more sinister and a little more frightening. I think I accept all that, maybe as she got started, but I actually think she enjoyed killing people. I ultimately decided that that was something that she really found deeply gratifying. It's almost impossible to imagine, but she clearly had a lot of problems with depression. I have this kind of, well, it's a little bit of a hyperbole to say, or a metaphor. Some people just get born on the wrong planet, and they never fit in, and they never feel at home being in the human form, and they never feel comfortable with their fellow human beings, and they're always kind of depressed and feeling out of place. And I think she felt that way her whole life, for whatever reason. And the one thing that sort of allowed her to have this rush that would carry her out of her depression and make her feel in control was killing people. Thinking about it, planning it, thinking about it afterwards. I think it was something that she got into. The government's hinted at several times that they thought that she might have been responsible for killing quite a few more people than the ones that she was really charged with. But they picked the 4 that they could prove most easily, and that is why they focused on that. So that's the best answer I can give to you. It was a complete mystery. She was not an ogre. She didn't have any particular prior record. She was a middle-class person. She had no particular history of psychiatric problems or anything. She just, I think, for whatever reason, enjoyed doing this. So after it was over, I really thought a lot about it and tried to think about how I might write about it. And I wrote a piece in the Boston Globe, an op-ed piece, just describing what it was like to preside over a death penalty case. The experts that I appointed, dealing with the media, the cost, the intricacies and subtleties of the trial, just to give people an idea of what is it like. My ultimate conclusion, and the point that I made in the op-ed article, was I'm comfortable leaving to our democratic process the choice of whether we have a death penalty. That process in Massachusetts, through a legislature, has led to the decision that we do not have a death penalty in Massachusetts. On the federal level, Congress has decided that in certain instances we will have a death penalty, which is why we had this death penalty case in Massachusetts. It was a federal case. It was a VA hospital, a federal facility, and that's why it ended up in my court and was subject to federal law. So people have to think about where they come out on that. But there is one conclusion that I think is unavoidable based upon my experience presiding over a death penalty case, and that is, if we're going to have a death penalty, there's a price. And the price, inevitably, is the execution of innocent people. Mistakes are going to be made. We hope they won't be made too often, but it's not possible to go through anything as intricate and as emotionally and morally demanding as a death penalty trial without once in a while having a result that somebody who actually didn't commit the crime gets sent off to Indiana and is executed. And there's plenty of evidence now that that's in fact true. We have DNA evidence which has been available now for the last 10 or 20 years, and there have been dozens of people taken off death row when evidence comes to light, which is now subject to sophisticated testing, which showed without any doubt that the individual who was convicted and sentenced to death in fact didn't commit the crime. Now, we hope that doesn't happen very often, but if you want to have a fair discussion about the death penalty, you have to acknowledge there's a price and then talk about whether the price is worth it. So that's what I wrote about. But when I got done with it, I thought, well, I don't think I've really done an adequate job of conveying what it's like to be in the middle of a capital trial. So I sat down, and for 7 years I wrote The Hanging Judge. I was still full-time judge, and so I wrote Saturday and Sunday mornings from 8 o'clock in the morning, or 8:30 in the morning, depending on how lazy I was feeling, until lunchtime. And I wrote several drafts of the book that eventually became The Hanging Judge. I invented a federal judge named David Norcross, and I put him in Springfield. He's a little bit like me, but not too much like me. And I had him, he's a young federal judge, kind of green, and he draws this death penalty case. Doesn't have anything to do with the VA hospital or a nurse. It's a drive-by shooting in Holyoke where a drug dealer is killed, and a young soccer mom, who's a volunteer nurse, catches a stray half a block down the street, and she also dies. And it's brought as a death penalty case. And Judge Norcross then has to go through, in fiction, what I went through in real life. And what I try to do with my writing is to take the reader sort of by the hand and bring them up on the bench with me and say, come on, sit next to me, here we are, we're going to do this together. And I'm going to put you inside my head as you handle this very challenging process. And so that's what I tried to convey. And I wrote it from multiple viewpoints. The book is told from the point of view of the defense lawyer, who's a man named Bill Redpath, the prosecutor, who's a woman named Lydia Gomez Larson, the defendant's wife, the victims' families, and the law clerks, and, well, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 people altogether. Because I found that if I wanted to do a fictional representation of the criminal justice system, I had to do it from multiple viewpoints, because it's a weave of people. Our justice system, which is quite flawed, but which is also amazing that we have it, is nothing but people. Police officers, prosecutors, witnesses, families, judges, probation officers, clerks, and so forth. That's what we do. And we create through this machine, which is made up of human beings, this process which expresses our ideal about our democratic society, which is that there has to be a place where people can come and have their disputes heard, and where the job of the people wearing the robe and making up that system is to give everybody a fair chance. Regardless of what your affiliations are, what your wealth is, you can come in one place where you can come and have your disputes heard. And that ideal is very rare in the history of humanity and very rare in the world today. Mostly, I'd like to quote, I don't really even know much about Thucydides, but a Greek historian from about the 3rd or 4th century BC, talking about the wars between the Greek states then. And he said, the strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And that's the rule of history. The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. The strong just take what they want, and if anybody gets in their way, they just get chased in the woods or bonked on the head. And the notion that you have an institution that exists separate from that, whose job is to administer the law equally to all people, is just remarkable in the history of humanity, and remarkable really in the world today. It's relatively rare. So I'm very proud of being part of the legal system, and at the same time I'm aware that we have a long way to go to even begin to approach perfection or approach attainment of our ideals. And that's what I try to talk about, because it's a perfect landscape for a novel, because it's people who are struggling with various pressures. One of the characters in The Hanging Judge is a polio cop named Alex Torselli, and he gets all kinds of pressure from his brother to basically bag the case. And he eventually resists that pressure, but it's a close call. And so our justice system is very fragile and very precious. So I wrote the book, and it actually was successful, much to my delight. There's another strand in the book, which is a nonfiction strand, telling the story of 2 Irishmen from the early 19th century, in 1806, who were picked up just outside Northampton for a murder that they almost certainly didn't commit, and hanged after a one-day trial in Northampton. And there's still a monument to them right outside Northampton, which I visit occasionally, James Halligan and Dominic Daly. And I tell their story, partly because it's such a moving story, and partly because it shows that, you know, if we think that, oh, well, that was way back in the early 19th century, we've made so much progress, we could never make that kind of mistake. Bias and prejudice would never infect our system today. Well, I hope the story and the comparison makes you think a little bit more about that, because it's always a problem. I had no idea that the prejudice against Catholics, and particularly Irish Catholics in Massachusetts, was so virulent in the early 19th century. I mean, Catholics were really hated and feared, and particularly Irish Catholics. And that's so much a part of our culture today, it's hard to even imagine that could have been so terrible. So these two Irish guys were just luckless, and they got picked up, and the slogan was, they're Irish, they're Catholic, they're guilty. And that's what happened to them. So the novel did very well. As Ashley said, it got on the New York Times bestseller list, which I was really, really proud of and really delighted at. And so then I went to work on my second book called The One-Eyed Judge, which is also about Judge Norcross. And this time I take up another theme which is equally difficult for me, or almost as difficult as the death penalty. And this case involves an Amherst College professor named Sidney Cranmer, who was the defendant. And he is in his house and he receives a delivery of a DVD at the beginning of the book. And he takes the delivery of the DVD, and it turns out it is a DVD of really loathsome child pornography, which he apparently has ordered through the mail. The FBI comes right in the doorway almost as soon as the DVD is delivered, arrests him, seizes the DVD, and then the question from that point becomes, did he really order it, or was it something done by a disgruntled colleague or an unhappy student, and what's the story with Professor Cranmer? And the book, again, features Judge Norcross in a central role. He's the judge presiding over the case, and we have a community of characters, including the defense attorney, this time a woman, a lawyer named Linda Ames, a prosecutor, the FBI agent who's leading the investigation and investigation of people charged with similar crimes, the law clerks, and we follow that investigation through the trial. Judge Norcross, my wife always teases me. Judge Norcross is in his early 40s, and my wife tells me, if you're going to have a guy in his early 40s, and you're going to have any kind of romantic theme in the book, there's only one thing you got to do. You got to kill off the first wife. You got to clear the decks for somebody to come in. If he's 40-something and he's never been married, it's like, okay, we got to explain that. If he's 40-something and he's divorced, then you got an ex-wife floating around and you got to deal with her. So when you're crafting the plot, if you want to have him available to hook up with somebody else, it's like Sleepless in Seattle. I don't know if you remember Tom Hanks. His ex-wife appears as a ghost a few times, and that allows him to get into his relationship eventually with Meg Ryan. And so that's Judge Norcross, and he has a sweetheart named Claire who teaches at Amherst College, and their relationship kind of parallels and complicates the legal plot. She kind of is on the edge, and from time to time gets tangled up in his work in ways that aren't very helpful for him. And they fall in love. And by the second book, they're thinking about getting married, but she wants to have children. She's about 37 or 38, getting to be time for her to do this if she's going to have kids. And he's not sure if he wants to have kids, because the world that he lives in as a judge professionally is so dark and dangerous. He's not sure he wants to bring children into the world. So this child pornography plot parallels their grappling with that, and they're trying to work out what happens. So that's the second book. I really enjoyed writing. I say a good day writing is like falling in love. It doesn't come along very often, but when you have a good day and you feel the plot is evolving in ways that are really interesting, or you have a good passage of dialogue, or a good character that you're beginning to get to know better, you really are dancing on your toes for the rest of the day. I write mornings. I don't know about you all, but my IQ from 8 to noon is about twice what my IQ is from 2 to bedtime. It fades off pretty badly in the afternoon, and I need to try to take advantage of when I'm at my brightest. And then I write in the mornings. And now I'm working on the third book, the third Judge Norcross book. And that's going to be fun. I think it's going to mostly take place in Boston this time. I worked in Boston for a number of years, and I think I'll just place the third book in Boston and see how that goes.
How long did it take you to write that one?
The first book, it took me 7 years.
And the One-Eyed Judge?
And the One-Eyed Judge more like 2.5. The first book, I was just really wandering around on my own, and The novel was, the original draft was about 180,000 words, 180,000 words, not pages.
I was gonna say, whoa.
Yeah, Encyclopedia Britannica. It was 180,000 words, which was like 700 or 800 pages. And the agents that I was trying to peddle the book to said, you got to get that baby down to around 100 or 110,000 words, or nobody is ever going to buy it. It's just too fat, takes up too much room on the shelf. Nobody's going to read it. Nobody reads Moby Dick anymore, or unless they do, they're in an English class. So you gotta cut it down. And so I had to cut a lot of some of my favorite characters and things to get the book down to 110 or 115,000 words. And it eventually got down there and it got published. But the process of getting a book published, writing it, well, when you're writing the first one, you have no idea whether it's ever going to go anywhere. You just have to have a love of writing and be disciplined enough to keep at it. And for the most of the time, those years that I was writing it, I just had to write because that's what I like to do, or one of the things that I like to do. But I'm a judge, and judges sometimes have a problem with excessive ego and self-love and sort of narcissism, because you come into the courtroom and somebody says, "All rise," and you go in there and you stand up on the bench and everybody stands up. Believe me, the first few times that happens when you're a new judge, it's really kind of disoriented. And you stand up there and you talk to the lawyers and they say, "May it please the court," or "If your honor, please," and everybody's very respectful, and you begin to think, boy, my wife thinks I'm a blockhead, but when I come into court, man, I'm really it. And you get a very high opinion of yourself. Well, a beautiful antidote of that.
That's why he likes to go to work.
That's why I'm a TGIM person. You want an antidote to that, try and sell fiction, because they treat you like dirt. They don't care whether you're a judge or whether you're an ambassador to the Court of St. James. If your book has legs, they're interested in talking to you, and if it doesn't, it's boom. You really, and I took a long time, it took me more than a year just to find an agent. You really can't get a book published if you don't have an agent. It's very hard. And then it took my agent probably another year to find a publisher. So when I wrote the second book, I already had my agent, I already had my publisher, and I also had an editor that my publisher made available to me, and that was really helpful. And the result was two things. One, I was able to write the second book more quickly, and secondly, I think maybe the second book's a little better than the first book. Not putting The Hanging Judge down. I love all my books the same, and that's very dear to me because it was my first book, and it did get on the New York Times bestseller list. But I think the One I Judge is maybe a little tighter. It's maybe a little bit more compelling read, and I worked on it. Yeah?
I did not read your book.
Uh-huh.
I listened to your talk.
Huh.
The reason I wanted to know, how does the modern judge define pornography?
Pornography? Well, there isn't a definition of adult pornography. That's now legal. Citizens are entitled to look at adult pornography without any restriction. And part of the reason for that is that it became impossible to define what is pornography. And there was an extraordinary amount of litigation, and they attempted to define it as being offensive to prevailing community standards, a lascivious display of this, that, or the other thing. And every time they tried to define pornography, they kind of fell on their faces. In fact, Justice Potter Stewart, in the middle of this litigation about what could be published and what couldn't be published, made a famous statement in one of his opinions where he says, "I cannot define pornography, but I know it when I see it." Well, if that's the standard, we're really in trouble, because nobody can project when pornography will be illegal or not. And I'm diverting a little bit, but I'll get to a little bit, refine your question a little bit. The situation got to be so that the Supreme Court had to look at pretty much every single movie that got prosecuted as obscene, and where the people who made the movie or were selling the movie or were showing the movie were going to be put in jail. And their lawyers would fight it and allege that it was a violation of the First Amendment. and it wasn't really properly pornography, or the definition was too vague, and it would come up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would have to look at the movie. And one of the sort of hilarious aspects of this is that when these things were going before the Supreme Court, they had a screening room and the justices would come in and look at the movie. But Justice Harlan was blind. So he had to have a law clerk sit next to him and explain what's happening. Okay, now he's, and now she's, and he would be listening to this running description of what was going on, because he couldn't see what was going on, because he couldn't see. Shows a huge struggle, and the Supreme Court eventually threw in the towel. Adult people. Now, there's an exception for child pornography, and that's gone before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said that with children, that it is, you can prohibit distribution of pornography. The edges of the definition are very much disputed. There is, for example, an exception for material that has scientific, literary, or other value. And I actually get into that question in the one-eyed judge, because the defendant, Sid Cranmer, is a professor of English at Amherst College, and his specialty is a gentleman by the name of Charles Dodson, who wrote Alice in Wonderland under the nom de plume Lewis Carroll. And he was also a photographer, and he took pictures of, lots of pictures of little naked 7 or 8-year-old girls, and distributed them to his friends. And there was a lot of speculation that he might have been a pedophile. And in fact, I think I saw you sort of looking over my book out there. In the flyleaf, there is one of his photographs of the girl Alice Liddell, who was the prototype for Alice and Alice in Wonderland. And she's dressed up, and he calls her the beggar girl, but I think she's dressed up like a child prostitute. Her clothes are hanging off her, and she's holding her hand out for money, and she has a very kind of bold look in her eye. So what constitutes even child pornography on the edges can be controversial. The material that you're likely to see in court, there's absolutely no question about what it is. It's horrifying. So it's a problem.
Wasn't there something quoted by the judges of the Supreme Court that pornography is very personal? Looking at the artists that have painted naked bodies, naked children, are we looking at pornography, or are we looking at art?
Yeah, yeah.
And then, in your death penalty, there are nations.
Say that again?
There are nations
Yes.
who say, we will give you the death penalty, but they don't kill them. They give them 20 years, and after that they let loose. Sweden.
That's interesting. That's not what we do. Sometimes it takes a long time for people to get executed.
According to them, we have, as individuals, no right to take anybody's life.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah, there are some people who believe that, and I respect that. I come close to that myself. Yeah.
So when you write this book, and the books that you've written, how much of your personal self comes in?
A lot. I think...
what you believe and what you like. I do not know whether you're Christian, Catholic,
right.
or nowadays Pentecostal or evangelical, whatever you
Even do
are.
I, in a sense.
So how do you write a book and not, what shall I say, camouflage it with your personal opinion?
Well, I don't think of the book as an opportunity for me to put my own personal opinions on display. There are characters, and some of them quite sympathetic characters in the book, who are in favor of the death penalty. One of Judge Norcross's law clerks in the hanging judge is a guy named Frank Baldwin, and he and his law co-clerk get into arguments about the death penalty. And he says, I have a wife and a child, and if somebody was to deliberately murder them, I wouldn't consider it an adequate penalty to say, go over there in the corner and sit, you're a very, very bad boy for the rest of your life while we feed you and clothe you and shelter you and make sure that you have recreation and make sure that you have books to read and a TV to watch for the rest of your life. I wouldn't be satisfied with that as a response to that type of brutal act. And there are people who believe that very strongly. Why should we give people that kind of privilege to be locked up for the rest of their life? And there the debate starts. So my book, I hope, tries to make the point, which I think is a legitimate objective point, which is that the process is very demanding and very complicated and is not going to be flawless. But it doesn't really, I hope, tell the world, this is what I think about the death penalty. So that's what I try to do. Yeah.
Have you discussed a novel or sitting on the bench itself, where there are times that you have to set aside your own personal feelings on a certain case and say, listen, I can't do this case. I can't maintain my own personal impartiality. This case is too sensitive to me. I just can't handle it.
Yeah.
Or there are some judges say, oh, listen, my perspective in life is to maintain my impartiality. Since I've grown up in certain situations where you encounter all types of negativism. Growing up in your family can say, listen, you don't want to hang around with these folks. You don't want to hang around with those folks. And there's all these attributes that come in and say, oh, my parents told me these people are bad. And, and you grow up with that type of exposure. And, and as you become a professional person yourself, where you have to maintain law and make decisions, and sometimes you could say, gee, I shouldn't have let my personal feelings get into that case. I sent this person away, and I should have never done it. And maybe you could say, well, this is a case that's got to go to the jury because I don't want to get personally involved.
Right. No, that is a struggle. I actually have not had a case where I felt that my own feelings were so strong that I couldn't be impartial. On the other hand, I will just note that when I got to be 65, I'm now 71, when I got to be 65, I could take something called senior status, and that meant that another judge would come in and fill my position, and I would become pretty much semi-retired. And at that point, I said that I could sort of tailor my docket, and I stopped taking any child pornography cases at all at that point. Just didn't do it anymore, because to look at the material was so horrifying, and it leaves an imprint on your mind that's hard to get out. We're not talking about even 13 or 14. We're sometimes talking about 2- and 3-year-old children who are being horribly abused. I won't burden you with the things that you see, the photographs and the videos. And so so I just stopped taking those cases because I was basically kind of burnt out. And then when my successor was appointed, a few months after that, I dropped criminal cases. I did 20 years or more than 20 years of sentencing people, often to very lengthy prison sentences. And I said, well, that's enough. I've sentenced 793 people. I had my clerk come and tell me. And 793 is a good round number. So I just decided I wasn't going to do any more of that. And the new judge does the criminal, and I just do civil. So I do civil rights cases, police misconduct, corporate litigation, personal injury cases.
There are times when you probably wake up in the middle of the night, geez, I feel like somebody got out and they're going to come after me.
Once in a while, I still feel that. I have a thing, my wife always teases me, whenever I sit at a restaurant, I like to sit with my back to the wall so I can see what's going on in the room. I did a reading, one of these readings at one time at Greenfield Community College, and I was signing books afterwards, and a man came up to me and said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And I said, "Sorry, I don't." He said, "You put me in jail for 3 years." And I said, "Wow, I'm sorry. How are you doing?" And he said, "It's okay, you were fair." He said, "I'm doing okay. I've been out for a while. I'm back with my family, and I was going through a rough time, and you treated me fairly, and will you sign my book, please?" So I did. And then just about 2 months ago, I was doing a reading, and I noticed a woman was hanging around afterwards, and she came up to me after everybody's left, just the two of us, and she came up and held out her hand. And I said, and she said, "Thank you for putting my son in prison." He was really going the wrong way, and he was involved in an ungodly war. I just can't car that has like 180,000 miles on it, you roll the odometer back to 40,000 or 35,000 miles, and then you sell it. And he was doing that, and it probably, he found out, would probably be a couple of years in prison. And she said he straightened himself out. It's the best thing that could have happened to him. So, you know, once in a while, it does come up. But you know, it's funny. Criminals aren't all that different from the rest of us. And I have a couple who are pretty dangerous, and I take precautions. You know, we take some
I actually think the system's somewhat fair where somebody robs a convenience store, gets $60, and maybe, I don't say maybe kills the guy, or, you know, and then there's a guy, white collar crime, truck person, steals millions and millions of dollars, and you see the guy who stole $60 get more time than the guy who stole all the other money. You know?
Yeah, well, if he killed somebody, that's a different kettle of fish. But people who, relatively small drug deals, especially if they're involving heroin or crack, can get you very large sentences. And sometimes the sentences that drug dealers get are heavier than the sentences that white-collar criminals get. That's Congress's decision.
As a judge,
Yeah.
you don't criminalize racial. It's the jury that criminalizes.
Yes, the jury decides whether.
So they are the court. You are given guidelines to sentence.
Correct.
Understand? But why don't you, as a judge, say, I'm sorry, this is wrong guidelines?
Right, I can do that. It's a bit complicated, so I won't give you a whole seminar.
I just wanted to know.
On
So you
sentencing.
have guidelines. So it's not the wrong that you're doing. It's the, let me see if I'm making a right statement or a statement that might offend you.
You're going to have to work hard to offend me.
Because you're just following the guidelines. This says this.
Yeah.
I will do it, period.
Yeah.
If I don't do it, you will be called back, or somebody will say, I think you did wrong. And you don't want to be wrong because you are the judge who never does wrong.
Right, well, any judge who says that he never does wrong, I think he's talking through his hat.
That's why you become a judge.
Yeah, yes. I think you're aware a lot of the time as a judge that what you're doing is the best you can, and that sometimes you're going to be wrong. But let me just say one thing. The guidelines, yes, are the guidelines, but at least since 2005, for good reason, you can impose sentences which are above or below the guidelines. And so the
You
guidelines...
might be called, okay, I think you did wrong.
No, you can't, actually, not right now, not now.
No,
Yeah.
not-
Yeah, they've given a great deal of discretion back to judges. But here's the problem. We had very strict guidelines for quite a while, and what you're saying is exactly what happened. If I went outside the guidelines, I was likely to be taken up on appeal, and the Court of Appeals, which is in Boston, would slap me down and say, Judge Ponsor, you should have followed the guidelines. And I said, but I had good reason for not following the guidelines. I'd say, no, you didn't. Give him a sentence within the guidelines. And when that happened, when we had strict guidelines, these disparities between white-collar criminals and dirty-collar criminals and drug dealers and people who steal with a fountain pen, they began to smooth out. And the disparities between people of color and white people began to smooth out because the judges didn't have discretion. I hated the guidelines when they were that strict because I wanted to be able to sentence the individual person in front of me based upon what I know about that individual. Sometimes the guidelines are too low, sometimes the guidelines are too high, but I don't need anybody in Washington to tell me what the right sentence is for somebody. I have that degree of arrogance. I want my own discretion. In 2005, the Supreme Court decided a case called Booker. And in Booker, the Supreme Court said, this strict application of the guidelines is contrary to the Constitution. Judges should be given, they should take the guidelines into consideration, but they should be free to impose sentences outside the guidelines if they think it's appropriate based on a good reason. So, we judges got a good deal more discretion after 2005 when this case came down. And guess what? Black people and people of color began to get more severe sentences. White-collar people began to get lighter sentences than people who sold drugs, and then the disparities crept back in. One judge might be more severe on one thing than another judge. So there's this balance between maintaining a rigid system and giving judges discretion, and it can never be struck perfectly.
That's what I'm saying. The imposition of penalty
Mhm.
becomes personal.
To some extent, but not completely. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I mean, that could be a dispute.
yeah, yeah.
I'd like to go back to the remark you made about not being able to get some of this stuff out of your head afterwards.
Yeah.
And maybe this is an awful thing to ask you, but your book,
Yeah.
is it going to focus on what it's like to go through this and the legal process, or is it going to be something the reader can't get out of her head?
Very good question. It isn't very icky.
Okay.
That's the best way I can put it. You know, you can read it and it's not going to be horrible. There's references to it, but they tend to be oblique. I do not describe anything terribly graphic. The nature of the crime is clear, and the difficulty that there is in dealing with the crime is clear. But I don't get into graphic detail. Yeah.
In your two novels, and perhaps the one that you're writing now,
Yeah.
did you go into the backgrounds of the judges as far as saying that they're former prosecutors or they're former defense attorneys?
You know a little bit about Judge Norcross.
I mean,
Yeah.
as you're on the bench every day, you must sense that, gee, perhaps if this defense attorney was in my boots, he would rule on this case a little differently.
Uh-huh.
Because there's always this disparity that President Trump said, hey, the system's, he would say, the system is rigged,
Uh-huh.
by saying, and he's made the inference that's saying that the system's rigged because mainly the judges that are on the bench are former prosecutors,
Uh-huh.
or the governor's former prosecutor, or because they have this mentality as being a prosecutor, we're going to nail the bad guy. Whether or not he's a bad guy or not, we have a case, and we're going to fulfill our role to make sure that we can convict the person.
Uh-huh.
And the defense attorney is on the side saying, geez, this guy didn't do anything wrong. If you can't prove he's guilty, then he walks.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I know a lot of judges, and a number of them are ex-prosecutors, some of them are ex-defense counsel. My colleagues are one thing or another. Some people come out of law firms that do mostly corporate work. They don't do defense criminal one way or another, because 3/4 of our cases are civil cases. Only 1/4 of our cases are criminal. So the civil cases are a big part of the docket. And I clerked for a former prosecutor when I came out of law school, a guy named Joe Toro. He was the softest on criminals of any judge in the court. He was an ex-prosecutor. I have a colleague who's a former defense attorney. He is hard on criminals. So your background as either a defense attorney or a prosecutor does not necessarily predict how you're going to do your job when you get on the bench. Judges vary. I think you could do, if you want, you could just have somebody stand up in front of a machine, and the machine would go beepity beep beep beep, and it would spit it out like a fortune at the carnival. You put a quarter in, and it would say you're going to meet the love of your life in the next 6 months, or disaster awaits you, and the person could take the ticket and go off. But we entrust these decisions to human beings, imperfect human beings, inconsistent human beings.
Do you ever sense there could be a 3-time jury where it's, because, usually people go before the judge, usually get 3 bites out of the apple, they say.
Uh-huh.
But, so there are instances where they say, gee, if that similar case was heard with another jury, maybe those results would be different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, you can talk to many people today, and they'd say, oh, Jay did it, you know what I mean? But obviously, the people that you talk to on the street weren't there. They're not in the juries, they're not in the courtroom, and things
Right.
like that. So, they say if you're acquitted, that's the end of it, you know?
Yeah.
You could even go up the next day and say, yeah, I killed my wife, you know what I mean? And there's nothing to do.
Double jeopardy, yeah.
Right.
It's a human process. The only thing that I can say is, what's the alternative?
Right. Do you think maybe our jurors should be educated? If they go to jury school, so they know how to sense certain things versus somebody just coming off the street and,
Right.
because you got these role plays where someone could be more domineering on the jury and say, listen, I've got to go home and cook something for my kids, let's not bring this to next week, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, some jurors are pressured,
Yeah. That's true. And so you can say, well, okay, we won't have juries. We'll just have judges. That's what most countries in the world do now. I was in Lithuania talking to a group of students and trying to explain the jury system to them. They said, what do you have a jury system for? It's ridiculous. You should have trained people making these decisions, not juries. Most people in the United States have a big problem with that. They don't want the expert up there. They want a cross-section of the community, real people like them, listening to the case and making a decision. I happen to believe, my own experience is, juries are a very good thing.
Right,
But they aren't perfect.
certainly during times of segregation,
Yeah, oh yeah.
they accuse an African American person of crime, and it'd be an all-white jury.
Yeah.
And certainly the guy wouldn't get any mercy.
Yeah, on the other way around.
Right.
A white person charged with raping or killing a black person
Sure.
would walk out of the courtroom. So, if you, all I can say, well, I tell people, if you can't stand a complicated moral landscape, stay away from the American justice system, and in fact, stay away from any justice system at all. The fact of the matter is, the Greeks didn't have it figured out any better back in 400 BC. The Romans didn't have it figured out any better in 0 BC. The Brits don't have it figured out any better than the Americans. What do we do when we have these problems? People hurting other people stealing from other people, dogs running over and biting the neighbor, people's trees falling on people's houses, all the things that can happen. One solution is, if you've got a gun and he doesn't, you win. If there are 3 of you and 1 of him, that's what happens. If your family has been in charge for the last 200 years, and you've got lots of guys with big clubs, you don't have to go into all these niceties. We know how it comes out. In Iceland, they had this wonderful thing, is if they had a dispute, they would sneak up on the other family, nail all the doors closed, and burn the house down and wait outside. Well, that's pretty quick and effective summary process. So if you once get into gathering people together and establishing rules ahead of time that people are going to follow and apply them equally to everybody else, and then designate people who are going to be making up that system, whether they're police, prosecutors, judges, jurors, they're people. And it's a miracle how well it works. It's a miracle that it works at all. And the fact is, it really works most of the time. I would say, in 30 years on the bench, I probably had, I can think of 1 case where I disagreed with how the jury came out. And that was on a relatively minor point. It was a personal injury case, and I thought they were too generous to the plaintiff. But for the most part, juries get it right. Yeah.
Well, I heard this synopsis where whoever wins in court is the best storyteller. So,
Yeah.
so if the lawyer tells the best story to the jury, and he has all the flair that the jurors look at, and he's probably more well-dressed than the other, than his opponent, and so on and so forth. He's got a great smile and things like that. And he tells this great, Martin, he tells this great Mark Twain story.
Yeah.
And the jury just collectively says, hey, I believe it, and it could be a total lie.
All I can say is be careful. Because if you go in front of a jury and you look too sharp and you tell too good a story, most of the time in my experience, they're going to go back and say, that guy is slinging the BS. We don't believe him for 5 minutes.
I sat on a jury one time in Worcester, probably about 1920,
Yeah.
and it was a landlord case.
Yeah.
It was slumlord. The child had gotten lead poisoning and a few other things, and he was refusing to return the money, and they had pictures, and the landlord's all dressed snazzy, and the lawyer's like that, and he's talking and talking. Now, we had a few landlords on the jury as well. It was a pretty mixed group.
Yeah.
So we went back in and we were talking, and the landlord, one of the landlords goes, well, the landlord has it in the bag. I'm like, you make somebody like me sick. That's what I said. They have children.
Yeah.
They're sick because of lead that was in the house
Yeah.
that he never said anything about.
Right.
Refusing to give them back their money, refusing to help them. We ended up giving them double what they were looking for.
Yeah. So it's very hard to predict, you know, but juries can see through BS. You'd be surprised. I think they can see through BS better than judges can sometimes. I really do. I think judges, you know, you've been up there, you get a little jaded, you've seen it all, you know, and you're watching it and you're thinking about the next case that you have. And juries have a great BS radar a lot of the time. And I mean, good lawyers, I knew good lawyers, man. Guy in Boston, the first thing I do when I'm going before a jury, I take off my Rolex. I'm not going in with that. I got my wedding ring on. I got my, I'm wearing, I'm not wearing one of those suits that has the striped shirt with a white collar, you know, that make you look like you're selling Brooklyn Bridge. You know, humble, careful, stick to the facts. That's what jurors want. Don't waste their time, you know. So, yeah, they can be bamboozled, but I'm not sure judges can't be bamboozled sometimes, too.
So you handle cases where, say you're a law professor, and all of a sudden, one of your students comes up. He's a lawyer now.
Yep.
And he has to go before you, and he has to argue a case.
Yep. I've had former law clerks try cases in front of me. These are people I'm very close to. I just had one recently, and I granted summary judgment against him, and he's taken me up to the First Circuit Court of Appeals. It's like, I don't know, it's, you develop an expertise. You know, it's like if you're a bowler, you learn how to do a hook, you learn how to knock out a split, and if you're a judge, you learn to be neutral.
Right, but
most of the time.
But certainly at your age, you have lots of, you know, lots of close friends and things like that, and sometimes you have to say, listen, after this case, we're not friends anymore.
Well, no, if they're really close, friends, then I just recuse myself. I have certain lawyers who I just don't hear their cases. But we've been going for, I'm happy to stick around for another little bit, but we've been going for about an hour and 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here. I love talking to you all. This has really been great. And, yeah, good. It's been a wonderful chat.
Yes,
I
thank
really
you very
appreciate
much.
it.